worker, an occasional dunning letter, cups of lapsang souchong, half-empty bottles, and more of that notepaper, cobwebbed with his spidery handwriting. At last she saw him. He was stretched out in a chair by the window, arms loose by his side. His beard had gone, and for once he looked indifferent to the world. Next to him there were 3 sealed letters and a sheet of paper bearing a message. Outside, Hampstead remained blank with snow, and nothing much moved. In the wider world, soldiers were still returning from war, while refugees tried to make their way home. Society was rearranging itself after 6 years of armed conflict, genocide, and upheaval. It was starting to rebuild and reconfigure according to new indices of fear and hope, but it would do so without this man. Late on Saturday, 21st February 1948, aged 54, Geoffrey Pyke had taken his own life. As Time magazine put it the following week, it was the only unoriginal thing he had ever done. This is the story of a man described in his Times obituary as one of the most original, if unrecognized, figures of the present century. Geoffrey Pyke was hailed by J.D. Sage Bernal as not only a genius, but one of the greatest geniuses of his time. Lancelot Law White, who helped develop the jet engine, compared him to Einstein, adding that Pyke's genius was more intangible, perhaps because he produced not one, but an endless sequence of ideas. A scientist who worked alongside him felt he stood out among his fellows like the north face of the Eiger in the foothills of the Alps. For another, this was the sort of man who would have invented the wheel. Everyone seemed to agree on the quality of his mind, yet few could understand why he had committed suicide. Fewer still had any inkling that he might have led a double life. During the Second World War, without any military background or relevant qualifications, Geoffrey Pyke was appointed Director of Programs at Combined Operations. As one of the right-hand men of its buccaneering chief, Lord Louis Mountbatten, he was responsible for a stream of schemes, feints, and military inventions, including the idea, known as Pluto, for an oil pipeline under the English Channel, and another proposal whose advantages for Prime Minister Winston Churchill were so dazzling that they do not at the moment need to be discussed. Of another plan, Churchill wrote, "Never in the history of human conflict will so few immobilize so many." Both had at their heart an ingenious use of ice. It was also around this time that King George VI heard about Pyke and became known for his impersonation of Mountbatten's most colourful boffin, which involved exaggerated strokes of the royal chin. At the time Pyke wore a goatee. That he was the subject of lively stories told by Dickie Mountbatten to his cousin the King hints at a bright and unbuttoned personality. To look at, Pyke was certainly distinctive. Friends describe his immense natural dignity. One man compared him to a Russian princeling. For the Nobel Prize-winning playwright Elias Canetti, he was like a figure on a Byzantine icon. By the end of the war, there was a rich folklore of stories about Pyke and his various wardrobe malfunctions. It might be his flies getting stuck open, his preference for no socks whatever the weather, or his use of a shoestring instead of a tie. He was capable of standing out in any setting, a fluorescent thread on a Hessian sack, no matter where he went, and in many ways he cultivated this image of himself as the odd man out. But these tales told to the King were built up around more than the way Pyke conducted himself or his sartorial idiosyncrasies. At their heart was his extravagant ability to solve almost any problem put to him. Stranger still, his solutions seemed to work. Geoffrey Pyke had a genius for innovation. He was one of the great innovators of the 20th century, both in the staggering range of his radical ideas and in his technique. He was involved in the birth of, to name just 5, a revolutionary kindergarten based on Freudian psychoanalysis, the mass observation movement, a pioneering charity, the NHS, and the Devil's Brigade, the maverick American-Canadian commando unit to which today's US and Canadian Special Forces trace their origin, and which provided